Hello, and welcome to the Collapse Life podcast. I'm your host, Zara Sethna. Before we bring on today's guest, I just want to make one quick clarifying point. Some people may wonder why we talk so much about debt, inflation, financial topics like that, when this is clearly not a financial or an investment channel. And the reason is because the aim of our channel is to look at the way the world is changing around us. And those changes are very deeply tied to economic issues. We're not experts on the topic, so we like to invite on people who have a deep understanding of those matters. And that includes today's guest, John Rubino. John is a former Wall Street analyst, a blogger, a prolific Substacker, and the author of many financial books. So, John, welcome to the show. We're thrilled to have you and hope you can help us make sense of some of this.
Well, thanks for having me on, Sarah. It's nice to meet you.
You as well. You as well. We've seen many interviews with you, so it's great to have you live and in person. So I just wanted to start. Let's talk a little bit about how the economy is tied to these major societal changes, and specifically one concept that I know I've heard you talk about before, which is de-dollarization. So people see headlines like the dollar is going to end, and they just kind of freak out. So I just hope we could put a little perspective on it and just talk a little bit about what does de-dollarization actually mean?
Well, yeah, the dollar is not going to end. It's the world's reserve currency, and the U.S. is the biggest economy with the deepest, most liquid capital markets. So the dollar is always going to be or not always, but for the foreseeable future, the dollar will be used for trade, and it'll be a place to store wealth, things like that. So it's not going to go away. But what's happening now is basically two things. One is that the U.S. has just gone crazy when it comes to borrowing money. To understand the genesis of that problem, you have to go back to 1971 when we broke the final link between the world's major currencies and gold. Having a link to gold used to control how much currency a country could create and how much debt they could take on. When we took that away, we basically handed a unlimited credit card to the world's major governments, with the US in particular, because we had the world's reserve currency. Everybody wanted dollars, so we could create as many new dollars as we wanted, borrow as much money as we wanted, and then send those dollars out into the global economy for which people would give us real stuff. So we've been doing that ever since. And because of that, there's a growing oversupply of dollars in the world, which makes the value of the dollar go down. That's one thing that's happening at an accelerating rate. In 2022, we had official inflation of 8.7% and unofficial, probably much closer to the truth, inflation of like 12% or so. In other words, the dollar lost a big chunk of its purchasing power. So that's going on, and it's not ending because we're continuing to take on massive amounts of debt. That's going to lead to overcreation of currency, which will lead to devaluation of the dollar. Now, at the same time that that's happening, we've been abusing the privileges that come with having the world's reserve currency. And we started to use the dollar as a weapon. If anybody steps out of line from the dictates of the U.S. global military empire, we kick them off the SWIFT international banking settlement system, or we impose sanctions so that nobody's allowed to buy whatever they have to sell. And we basically abuse other countries who get in our way. And that's leading a lot of other countries to look for ways around using the dollar so they don't have to be as exposed to what they see as U.S. predation. And mainly the countries that are taking actual steps to get away from the dollar include China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, quite a few others. But these are big players out there. And what they're doing is first of all, they're cutting trade deals with each other in their own currencies. So for instance, Russia will sell oil to India and get rupees in return. Although that's not working out really well for them, but that's the original deal. And China is using the yuan to buy things around the world. So they don't have to use dollars as often as they do or have in the past. And that trend is called de-dollarization. And it's also accelerating. These governments that used to keep dollars as reserve assets. In other words, they would hold US Treasury bonds as the basis of their national monetary systems. Well, they're starting to sell their T-bonds and buy each other's currencies and buy gold. So this trend away from the dollar is accelerating on both of these levels, where on the one hand, the dollar is losing purchasing power. On the other countries are trying to use fewer dollars, and that's lowering the demand for dollars out there. So you put those two things together, and it means potentially dramatic problems for the dollar going forward, because we're devaluing it at the same time other countries want to use it less and less. Right. And at some point that becomes a crisis. Right now it's a kind of a slow burn, but that could change dramatically in the not too distant future.
Is there anything that the United States could do at this point to kind of pull back from that brink and maintain its dominance in the currency?
Yeah, we could start behaving better. We could stop borrowing incredible amounts of money at the governmental level and encouraging the private sector to continue to borrow huge amounts of money. We're not going to do that. Increased borrowing is baked into the cake for the U.S. The other thing that we could do is stop being so aggressive, especially as it pertains to the dollar around the world. And it looks like we're also not going to do that, at least not with the people who are in charge right now, because the U.S. is run by, the term for the guys in charge is, generally speaking, neocons or neoconservatives. And those are people who think that the U.S., with 5% of the world's population, ought to continue to rule the world for the next 1,000 years, and they'll do anything it takes to make that happen. They're blundering into World War III right now, which, by the way, makes everything else we talk about irrelevant. If we start a shooting war with Russia and China, it doesn't matter what happens on the financial front. We are absolutely screwed regardless, and we're blundering in that direction. The guys in charge seem to think it's okay for us to have a nuclear war, or for at least to risk a nuclear war, because they consider it to be survivable. And if we lose a few million people, that's okay in the scheme of things, because if it ends with them in charge of the world, well worth it, and I just find that baffling. But it seems to be our current policy, and it's unlikely to change in the near future. It's possible we elect somebody next time around who tries to change it, and they'll probably just be assassinated. So it doesn't look like we can fix this in the short run. So sorry, long answer to a short question, but no, we're not going to fix any of this in the near term. It's going to go on as it is and accelerate until we have a gigantic financial crisis at a minimum out there.
Right. Yeah. So you talked about this assemblage of countries in Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, known as the BRICS. And we wrote an article about this on Collapse Life, was one of our first articles, about how there's very little that kind of ties that group of countries together. In fact, some of them have been longtime rivals. And the motivation seems to be just the anti-dollar, the sort of move to do something against the United States. So, this is nothing new. This has been a long time coming. Is it sort of coming to a head right now? And what do you see as the sort of next step in this BRICS move?
Well, we only will know what the really important points in this process are in retrospect. We'll look back and go, oh yeah, okay, that's where it changed. And right now, it doesn't look like we're at any kind of a major turning point. It's kind of a trend that is continuing. But, as you said, these guys have trouble, the BRICS countries have trouble cooperating, because most of them are dictatorships, of different flavors. And you throw them together, and it's not likely that they're going to be able to trust each other to the extent that would be necessary to, for instance, create a gold-backed currency that they can use that would compete with the dollar. That requires a lot of trust and a lot of restraint that dictatorships aren't normally known for. So the idea of the BRICS emerging, coalescing, and becoming a major threat to the U.S. in international finance in the space of a couple of years, that's probably far-fetched. On the other hand, there's a saying, at least in the Islamic world, maybe further afield than that, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And they all have a common enemy right now. So it's possible that they're sufficiently motivated to cooperate in ways that they wouldn't otherwise be able to. to get some things done. These bilateral trade deals are a big deal. They're not definitive in any way, but they are lessening the need for dollars. And the sale by foreign central banks of dollar-denominated assets is ongoing, and the accumulation of gold by those central banks. Right now, central banks are major buyers of gold, which they really haven't been since the 1960s. They've been net sellers of gold up until just lately, and then they shifted gears and started buying again, and now the buying is accelerating. So to the extent that these central banks replace their dollar assets with gold, that gives them an element of freedom from the U.S. And the further that goes on, the less powerful the U.S. is monetarily around the world. So they're gaining power by doing all these things. The BRICS countries have a kind of a replacement for the World Bank, kind of a replacement for the IMF, all up and running. They've got a replacement for the SWIFT International Bank Clearing System, and they're replacing dollars with gold in their central banks. So this is ongoing, and it's happening, and it's consequential. It's just not clear at what point, we hit that tipping point where all of a sudden the power dynamic shifts in a really fundamental way really quickly. I don't know when that happens, but the trend is clearly in that direction. And this is a very big deal for the West because we're inflating away our currencies. At the same time, the rest of the world has less and less use for our currencies. So that's a very big deal at some point. And when that becomes apparent to the world is not clear, but it might be soon. It might be 5 years or 10 years. We can't know, and we will only know in retrospect.
Right. So we don't know when it's going to happen, but we know something's going to happen. And you've already mentioned sort of two looming crises: a potential war, a potential catastrophic financial crisis, more so than what we're in now. So kind of a two-part question, I guess. What is that going to look and feel like for us as Americans? And what can we do to prepare? So you mentioned gold. You mentioned it more at a kind of a national level, but I want to talk about gold potentially as a strategy at a personal level, but also beyond that. What are other things that people can be doing to prepare themselves now for what's to come?
Yeah, well, life will get a lot harder. And, it's hard to say beyond that specifically in which ways it'll get harder. There will be inflation, which means, living your life will be way more expensive relative to the money you make. Things like that. People get thrown out of their jobs. There will be turmoil in the financial markets that just basically evaporate a lot of nest eggs. Things like that will probably happen in, late stage currency crisis. Now, that, it's a little bit tricky because we can't predict with any kind of specificity exactly what happens. But generally, you look at the past eras when there was a lot of turmoil, the 1970s, the 1930s, really even 2022. And there's a lot of similarities. When your currency becomes less valuable and the price of things go up, you wish you'd stockpiled, right? If food is incredibly expensive, you wish, if you're not already there, you wish you had some land that you could grow food on. You wish you had stocked away a lot of rice and beans and things like that in the garage. In other words, you wish you had prepped. So the preppers, the people who, once had this aura of kind of right-wing crazies, are turning out to be the people who had the best lifestyle for being ready for what's coming. So, we adopt a lot of those strategies, and we're halfway there. And that means becoming as food self-sufficient as possible, becoming generally as self-sufficient as possible. In other words, as handy as you can be, and in terms of energy, have a fallback if the utility isn't going to work as well as it did in the past. Maybe be armed. It's funny. A lot of people are appalled by the idea of, well, what's coming might be something that you should probably have a gun for, but that's potentially true. We're seeing civil unrest already, and let that spread, and you will probably wish you were armed. So that's another thing you can take a look at. And, it's interesting. Gun sales are through the roof in the United States, and women are bigger buyers of guns than men are right now. So a lot of people across the spectrum in the U.S. are kind of getting the idea that if we don't have a civil war, we might have a civil war, but if we don't have a civil war, we could still have civil unrest. And those videos on TV could be coming to your town. And so you want to prepare for that kind of thing. And an offshoot of that is that, we're in a lot of ways an isolated culture right now. We really don't hang out with our neighbors the way we used to. And I think that's a huge mistake, because you can be as prepped as you possibly can be, but if you're alone, you're still very vulnerable. So you should be embedding yourselves as much as possible in your community, making as many friends as possible, making sure they know that you've got their back, so that they have your back when something happens. And which is, again, that's how we always should have lived. We should have been kind of sort of food self-sufficient with a garden. We should have been able to defend ourselves. We should have had neighbors who we could count on. And we drifted away from all of those things. So to the extent that we drift back to them, that's healthy. And on the investment side, when a currency is losing value in a disorderly way, the assets that depend on that currency for their value tend to lose value most quickly. And that, in a currency crisis, that means government bonds are bad things to own. And you can go back to the 1970s for this. If you had a portfolio of government bonds, they lost half to 2/3 of their value during the course of the currency crisis in that decade. Same thing could happen again. In fact, it's already happening. The last year has been the worst year for bonds since at least the 1970s, and maybe beyond that. So if you had a bond portfolio right now, which was basically your safe portfolio, in other words, the risk-free assets, they lost half the value in the last couple of years. So you don't want to be in that kind of situation for the long term when things really get crazy, because the last few years they were very stressful in a lot of ways, but they're nothing compared to what's coming if you have a full-on currency crisis, and then that currency reset out there where they where they call in the old dollars and issue new ones, that kind of thing. So you don't want to own assets that are hurt by that kind of a situation, and you do want to own assets that benefit from it. So gold and silver are the obvious choice. They're really easy to do. You just go out and buy a bunch of gold and silver coins, store them very safely, which is a subject for a whole show, which we could do another time. But just store them safely so you can get a hold of them. And then the bedrock part of your financial life is relatively safe, because it's in old forms of money that can't be inflated away, and that will tend to go way up if the national currency is tanking. And then other assets that are kind of in the same category that are a little bit more complicated to analyze and buy would be, oil wells, energy assets, farmland, things like that. And there are lots of mutual funds and stocks and things that you can buy that they give you exposure to those things, which will also probably go up in a currency crisis. So you can shift your portfolio or your financial life over pretty easily away from financial assets like bonds and bank accounts and things like that, and over towards things that'll hold their value. And say it takes you a year to do it. At the end of that year, you're financially ready for a lot of the stuff that's going to come. And I think it's definitely worth the effort. You should definitely be looking at things like that. And that's on my Substack newsletter, that's what I focus on most, is actionable stuff, where okay, we get that a crisis is coming. Exactly what should we be doing about that? And the stuff I just talked about are important parts of that process. You should be doing a lot of those things and some other things to get ready for what's coming.
Mm-hmm. And your Substack is a great place for people to start in terms of just getting aware and learning really tangible and practical things. On that, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about gold and silver. Is it as easy as just going out and buying coins? Should people be doing a little bit of research first? If so, where should they look? What's a good place to start learning a little bit about this?
Well, there are a lot of books out there. One of the benefits of this thing taking way longer to work out than it should have. In other words, things should have fallen apart like in 2000, and definitely in 2012 or 2011 or whatever. But they didn't. We've kind of held on for a really long time. And the benefit of that is it has allowed an awful lot of good people to express their ideas in this space. So there are some really good books on gold and silver out there. And Gold Money's James Turk and I co-wrote 2 books on that subject. One was The Coming Collapse of the Dollar, and the other was The Money Bubble. And Peter Schiff has done some good stuff out there. He has 3 or 4 bestsellers that all kind of cover this material. And Jim Rickards wrote the Currency War book back in 2012, and he's done 5 or 6 since then. Have all been bestsellers. They're all well written and well reasoned how-to books for this stuff. So you can start by reading 1 or 2 of those books to get a sense of basically how the market for gold and silver work. And then look for a good gold dealer. There are some online dealers that are very trustworthy and have excellent Better Business Bureau ratings. And you can buy gold and silver online through them, or you can go to a local coin dealer and talk to them and get to know them. And, these are people you can meet face to face and kind of get a sense of, and look at their reviews online and everything, and find out what they charge relative to the spot price and relative to the online dealers. And it's like shopping for anything else. You want to know what products you want, and then you want to know the best place to buy them. And in that sense, precious metals are really no different from TV sets or cars. You just have to have enough of an understanding of the market to be able to make the right decisions. And it takes a little bit of research in precious metals, but not all that much. They're not that complicated. I would say storing them is a lot more complicated than actually buying them. But one piece of advice as far as this goes is don't jump with both feet into that market immediately, because we don't know what prices are going to do in the short run. They could go way down, or they could shoot way up, or they could just be stable for a few years. So do things like dollar cost averaging when you're buying gold and silver, where you allocate a certain amount each month to buying the coins or bars that you've decided you want. And then just do that each month. And then don't stress over the price action, because if the price goes down, you're buying more ounces with your fixed dollar amount each month. If the price goes up, that's fine, because what you bought in the past is up now, So that's a psychologically really comfortable way to get into a new asset. And let's see. From there, the idea of gold and silver mining stocks starts to become important, because you want to own physical gold and silver, but you don't want all physical gold and silver. And you can branch out into things like the highest quality gold mining stocks, or silver mining stocks, or oil stocks, or uranium stocks. You can make a portfolio of equities that cover the ground of real assets. And again, you don't want to put all your money into those either, because you never know what's going to happen in the banking system. If the brokerage houses and the banks get closed down for a while when all this is going on, which they have in the past, so it's a completely conceivable thing to have happen. You don't want all your money to be tied up in a brokerage account that you can't get to. So diversification is a big deal when you're shifting your financial life over into a new side of the money world. So you want to own some of several different things in some of several different places, and make sure you keep track of it. Make sure you update your will to cover where everything is. But with a little bit of diversification, you can be reasonably sure that you'll be okay no matter what happens. Because remember, we can't predict specifically what happens. We just know it'll be shocking when it does happen. But you, to the extent that you're diversified and you're in several different places, there's a good chance that at least a couple of those places aren't victims of crazy governments doing insane things. And your money will survive, and you'll be okay coming out the other end.
Right. Yeah. One thing with gold and silver, by the way, we would love to take you up on the offer to come back and talk to us about storage, because I think that
Sure.
is a very important piece. But one thing that's a bit of a concern, or potentially, and you can answer this for us, is Is there a risk that there's asset confiscation? So back in the era of FDR, that happened, and the government came and confiscated people's physical gold and silver. So is there a risk that that might happen again? And if so, where does that put those people who have been taking your advice up until now and carefully stacking their assets and doing their dollar cost average? What does that look like?
Well, you're right. We've confiscated assets several times in the past in the U.S. and then all around the world it happens. And they did make gold illegal to own in 1933, 1934. And so in that way, if you kept your gold and didn't give it back to the government, you became a criminal. Most people did not give their gold back and they got away with it. But the ones who did lost, because then they immediately revalued or devalued the dollar right after that. They made gold worth more and dollars worth less. So that gold you gave back to the government was a bad deal for you. And there are lots of other ways for governments to confiscate assets. Because remember, inflation is a hidden tax. It's kind of an asset confiscation because it makes your money worth less year after year. So the dollars that you squirreled away become less valuable, and the government gets to keep that extra value. And then there are things called, there are wealth taxes, where the government comes in and says, okay, everybody who has this much land or this big of a stock account or whatever, we're going to take X percent from you. And that could easily happen too. And then there could just be the flat out, from now on, you aren't allowed to hold gold anymore. That's less likely this time because gold isn't money yet. But if they get to the point where they want to go back on a gold standard and they need to accumulate a lot of gold in a hurry, they could call it all in and tell everybody that we have to give our gold back to the government. So, I would never advise people to do something that's against the law, but you have a choice to make if the government tries to confiscate gold again. You can be a criminal and keep your gold, keep it well hidden, or you can give it back and obey the law and be screwed over financially. So you'll have to decide at that point, and whatever is right for you. And they'll also possibly do capital controls, and that's where they don't let you take your money out of the country. You can keep your dollar-denominated assets here in the U.S., but you can't move it anywhere. And so how that works for a government is that it basically isolates the wealth they want to confiscate within a given place. So it's within the borders of the U.S., and then they can take their time and figure out different ways to steal from people. All of that's possible. Again, we can't know the details, but those are things that could happen in the future. And again, diversification is one way you deal with that. If you've got different kinds of assets in different places, then there's a decent chance that some of those things aren't confiscated. And if you've got things really well hidden, there's a decent chance that it just never comes up. The government can never find it, so that it can never take it away from you. But I think there's a decent chance that, at least with inflation, which is a guaranteed kind of asset confiscation that is definitely coming, some of that other stuff might happen too. And all we can do is try to hide things as well as possible and try to diversify as well as possible.
Well, I don't know if we can wait until next time to tease people about a conversation about storage of the physical assets. So can you give us a little kind of quick bullet points on some of your suggestions on, if you do go into buying physical gold and silver, what should we do with it?
Okay, well, you definitely want some in a place where you can get to it. That is called in hand gold and silver. And you, when you start buying physical gold and silver bullion, the first things you should buy are probably the things that you can get to and you're going to hide in a safe place. Now, the tricky part with this conversation is that if I name my favorite 5 safe places, then all the potential thieves are out there listening to this too. And that gives them a shopping list, where to look when they break into somebody's house. So one thing that you can do to get some ideas is just to Google it. How do I sell it? How do I store my gold and silver? And you'll find all kinds of really creative ideas. And get a couple, implement them, and do not brag about it. Next time you're at a dinner party, don't be talking about your gold and silver bullion and how you found this great place to hide it and everything. It's just your secret and the secret of the one or two people you trust with your life that you tell about it, because that's another part of it. You got to hide it really well. But if you hide it so well that if something happens to you, nobody ever finds it again, then you kind of defeat your purpose, right, of intergenerational wealth. So some people have to know about it. So as I said, this is tricky because there aren't any perfect answers. But you definitely want somebody to know about it. And then you don't want to, go on trips in the same car with those two people or anything, because if anything happens to the three of you, then it's gone. So you need to think that part of it through. Once you've got the home storage thing down, then you branch out to maybe a bank safe deposit box, although that's got a lot of risks associated with it, but it's a place. It's part of the diversification. Then there are storage companies that that's their thing. They store gold and silver and other valuables for people. Find one that's very well reviewed, and then you can buy and ship some gold and silver coins to that place. They'll keep it in a vault for you. It's called allocated storage. It means you own those particular coins. It's not unallocated, where you basically have a piece of paper that says they're obligated to come up with some gold and silver coins for you if you want them. You need allocated storage where you absolutely own that stuff. And then from there, you can branch out geographically and do the same thing with remote storage, but do it in another country. Switzerland is known for their gold and silver storage. Singapore is the kind of hot destination now for gold and silver storage. I have some in Hong Kong, which turned out to be not quite as good necessarily as Singapore, because Hong Kong is now part of China, and China is not nearly as trustworthy a country as some others. So you have to think that through too. Which country do you trust? And then which storage company do you trust within that country? Now, at this point, we're getting into really high levels of capital, right? If you're storing, gold and silver in 5 different places, that means you're throwing a lot of money at this. So that's not for everybody. But if it's, if you're somebody who can do that, then you need to think progressively in terms of diversification into the more complex, more distant things. And on the assumption that some of it will survive and some of it will if you do something like that, because it's highly unlikely that all the world's governments are going to go crazy simultaneously. It's going to be sequential, probably. And the US is maybe one of the first, and it may not be. So we can't know that ahead of time. But that's the process you want to be dealing with is, okay, if my country just completely freaks out and starts confiscating everything in sight, and we have a civil war and there's civil unrest, where do I want my assets to be? And it's a different answer for every person. But you need to start with that question and then take a look in the mirror and decide what works best for you.
No, that's perfect. I wanted to pick up on that a little bit in terms of sort of some of the vehicles that you've mentioned for investment, some of the safer places to store your wealth. I wanted to ask, are they more limited to people with high net worth, or are they things that just your everyday working person like us can take advantage of?
Well, everything's easier for people with a lot of money. So that's another one of those know yourself kinds of things. You need to start with the capital that you have and then figure out what's best for you given your means. And if you're a multimillionaire, you can do all the stuff I just mentioned without breaking a sweat. And if you're a more normal person, then you got to prioritize. And I think physical ownership is the one thing that you don't want to dispense with. You definitely want to own some assets that you can get a hold of, and that you might end up using someday. Like silver coins, I think, will be circulating money again during the really stressful part of this process. And a gold coin, say an ounce of gold, that represents something like a $1,000 bill or something like that. It's not very easy to use, but silver coins that represent maybe $100 bills in the new barter economy, when it happens, are very useful. So you want those on hand so you can go to the farmer's market And you flash a silver eagle or something to one of the people at the farmer's market, they will move you to the front of the line and give you anything you want. So that's why it needs to be accessible, because you may need to use it for exchange. It might need to be a form of money that you actually use instead of an asset that you hold on to as an investment. And you never know. As part of the whole bug out scenario, where you have to pick up and leave in a hurry, you want some also dollar cash, of course, because it's super liquid, but you want some gold and silver coins for that process. The old saying goes, you want enough to be able to bribe the border guards at any time, and then some after that. So that's all part of the thought process. And again, different for everybody, but a lot of this stuff is accessible to most people. For instance, you could buy small amounts of gold mining shares or oil. You can buy some Exxon stock or something like that, which exposes you to the energy market for not a lot of money, because you don't have to buy a lot of shares. But as a starting point, things like that are very useful. And even if it's not a lot of money, it's still psychologically useful, because you're taking steps. You're doing things that will help you in the future. You're lessening your risk, and wherever you start from, that's where you start from. And then you just as more money comes in, you use it as you've planned to allocate to different assets and things like that, and you just go on from there. I think so much of this stuff is as psychologically important as it is financially important, because if you're doing things that are part of an investment thesis, then you're not just freaked out by all the horrible things that are happening in the world. And it's hard to get out of bed if you just focus on the gloom and doom in all of this. But if you focus on, wow, I could make this much money if I'm right about this stock or these gold coins or something like that. And watch the movie The Big Short, which depicts people who saw a crisis coming, they took steps. It was really stressful, but they ended up making life-changing money. Fortunes are going to be made in the coming crisis. And if you're taking steps to help yourself be one of those people who makes one of those fortunes, then it's not nearly as stressful as it would be if you were just, suffering because all the horrible stuff is going to happen and there's nothing you can do about it. So I think life should be an investment thesis, and you should be thinking about, at least to an extent, what you can do with the money you make if you make good decisions, how you can help your friends, how you can help your family, how you can protect yourself. And that's a way healthier way to approach all this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if you don't end up making that great fortune, at least you can rest easily knowing I've done something. You're not sticking your head in the sand and pretending that nothing is happening. You can do something, diversify, just think about it, talk to your friends about how you can support each other. I mean, I think all of those things, as you say, will just help you feel like you've got a handle on it. You're taking some action and not panic.
Yes, because all of this stuff pays off. Even if the world somehow survives intact, what's coming, because you've still done the things you should have been doing all along. But now you're doing it with a goal, which is to survive and thrive in what's coming.
Right. I just wanted to talk quickly about banks. So we've heard other financial analysts like George Gammon saying that the banking crisis this year is worse than 2008. Is that true in your estimation? And if so, why are we not hearing about this? And what can people do to protect themselves?
I think the banking crisis that's coming is potentially at least as bad as 2008, 2009. But back then the derivatives books of the big banks blew up to such an extent that if the government didn't bail them out, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase would all be gone now. They would not have survived that. And it's not clear how this one plays out. It looks like the epicenter of this coming crisis is the local and regional banks, because they've got a lot of real estate related paper and government bonds on their books. And those things are getting crushed right now because commercial real estate is in this massive crisis. We raised interest rates dramatically after a period of very low interest rates. And that means all, the buildings, the office buildings and the apartment buildings that went up using that super cheap money from 3 or 4 years ago now has to be refinanced at today's interest rates. And a lot of those buildings are not viable on those terms, and they're being sold for half price, and the people are defaulting on them and everything. And so you got these banks that have all this paper on their balance sheets that now might be worth half what it was to begin with. So they're going to have to report those losses. And then that's going to spook depositors who pull their money out of these banks, which causes the banks to have to sell a lot more of those depreciated assets on their balance sheets to pay off their depositors, which leads to even bigger losses, which breaks the bank, which is going to spread throughout the 4,000 small banks there are out there, and force the government to step in and bail everybody out. That's one way that this could play out, and it could be a really big crisis. It just different in the details from the one in 2008, 2009. And it could shift the pressure over to the dollar, because we're already insanely over indebted at the government level and every other level. But let the government have to print $3 trillion new dollars in order to bail out a bunch of small banks, and maybe people take a look at the dollar and say, okay, that's it. I'm not holding this currency anymore. And so we get the currency crisis that leads to the currency reset. And it could be that the banks are the starting point for that process. So yeah, banking crisis coming, we'll see what form it takes, but it could morph into a currency crisis, which I think is a much bigger deal.
Yeah. How do you feel about cryptocurrencies? Is that something that people should consider as part of their diversification strategy?
Well, I love the concept of private sector technology-based money that isn't under the thumb of any regulatory agency or any government. So far, Bitcoin has been an incredible investment from back in the day. I got pitched Bitcoin back when it was like $20. And I passed, and so that's one of the big what ifs of my financial life for sure. But I don't know enough technically to be able to make any kind of a real prediction about the use case for Bitcoin. In other words, can it really become money? Can it be the base layer for the global financial system going forward? And to me, there are too many questions that I don't have the ability to answer before I would say yes to something like that. Because what happens when governments decide Bitcoin is a threat and they go after it and they make it illegal? We made gold illegal in 1934. So why wouldn't governments who feel threatened by cryptocurrencies make something like Bitcoin illegal in 2025 or something like that? It's a completely possible thing. And then what happens? And I don't have a good answer for that. There are people who have a lot more technical understanding of cryptos than I do, who would be fun to have on your show. I can give you some names if you'd like. And they make a pretty strong case for Bitcoin surviving and becoming a major part of the global financial system going forward. But they make the case with a lot of technical terms that I'm not conversant in, so I can't judge the case, but it's a good story. And it's probably something that becomes a big story for a while going forward. However cryptos play out, they're going to be in the news, and there's going to be a lot of debate, and maybe some sector specific crises and things like that. So I think if you have the time and the interest, learning about cryptos would be a really good use of your time, and maybe a profitable one. I won't say that yet, but I think it would be very useful to understand that sector.
Certainly. I would like to understand it, whether or not I want to invest in it. I think we're a little bit with you in terms of things that are tangible, things that you can actually pick up and hold and see with your own eyes, like farmland or gold and silver coins or whatever, tangible assets. That just makes a lot more sense. But perhaps I'm getting old.
Well, see, that's the thing. It could be that you and I are people driving horse-drawn carriages and looking at the first car and saying, nah, it'll never catch on. Horses are here forever. And we'll find out. Got to recognize that as a possibility, though.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. For sure. So you've given us really a wealth of very practical advice, and I really appreciate that. And once again, I think, anyone who's interested should really subscribe to your Substack and follow along and learn so much more. I wanted to ask, just as we close, we've talked already about some of the major things that are looming. We have elections coming up next year, so many unknowables, but what keeps you up at night and what gives you hope?
Well, two things keep me up at night. One is World War III, like we talked about. We're closer to that than we have been since maybe the Korean War or something like that, when we were actually fighting Chinese people. And it doesn't look like anything is going to get fixed anytime soon. The U.S. still is actively trying to isolate China and Russia, and it looks like we kind of want to pick fights with them. And if that happens, that scares me. I have two sons, and the idea of them being incinerated in a nuclear holocaust is just, I can't go there, But that to me is a very big deal, and it overshadows everything else that's going on in the world right now. The other thing, which won't kill us all, but it could make a lot of us wish we were dead, is creeping fascism, or the trend toward authoritarianism in the world right now. Censorship is becoming normalized around the world. And in the US especially, we're using the legal system to torment the sitting government's political opposition. And that's banana republic stuff, but it's happening here. So they're banning free speech in Europe and the rest of the English-speaking world. And we're setting up kind of a domestic KGB or something like that in the US, where we actively go after whoever dissents from the party line. And that's the kind of thing that once you start, it's hard to take back. And it feels like we're halfway there already. And hopefully, the people who believe in free speech end up speaking loudly enough and playing a big enough role in the debate that we can move the pendulum back a little bit. And, back to pre 9/11 days, before the Patriot Act and everything. And that could happen, but it doesn't look like it's in any way happening yet. So that scares me, that we end up in, a 1984 / Brave New World kind of system where there's no hope for the individual. So yeah. Okay. So we've got those two things to worry about. So I think we should focus on buying gold and silver and how much it's going to go up and how rich we're going to get. It's way easier to think about that.
Yeah, for sure. I think there is some hope that we are very fortunate here in the United States to have our Constitution and our First Amendment, and it is getting exercised, I think, quite well these past few years, with a lot of lawsuits, fighting back on freedom of speech, fighting back for freedom of speech, I should say. And so, hopefully the Supreme Court will hear these cases like Missouri versus Biden, and we will lay down some precedent around what we can and cannot do and say in this country. And I hope that I'm not being too optimistic, but we're very lucky that we have the Constitution to protect us. And we need to all be aware of what it says, and we need to fight for it.
Yeah. And you're right. There are some positive things happening. I didn't mean to be quite that gloom and doom on the free speech side there, because there are a lot of strong voices out there, and there are a lot of people who are succeeding in the courts and getting elected and things like that. And in the next few years, if they become the dominant force in this society, we'll be way better for it. So we can hope for that.
Definitely. Yeah. Is there anything that you wanted to add that I didn't ask about? Anything that you really think that people should be focusing on that maybe they're being distracted from right now?
No, you know what? We covered a lot of ground. Okay, wait. Yes, there is. And that is one way to view what's happening in the world today, is that we have kind of an aristocracy that's been allowed to take power. And that is a relative handful of incredibly rich people who exist up above the president, senator, Supreme Court justice level. And their goal is to siphon as much money as possible out of the 99% and into their own accounts before everything falls apart. And I think that a lot of the stuff that's going on now, the big debates in society, are really engineered debates, like black versus white, gay versus straight, the whole immigration thing. These are ways that the aristocracy is using to distract the peasants from the theft that's taking part at the top of the pyramid. And so if we start paying attention to the world in that sense and see the argument as really about class, right? It's extremely rich versus everybody else, rather than all these other divisions that are kind of artificial. I think we'll see more clearly what's going on and have a better sense of what we can do to stop it.
Right on. Yeah, absolutely. I want to wrap up for today. We have covered a lot of ground, but there's so much more. So I really hope that you would come back and do part 2 and part 3 with us at some point. Great. Before we go,
Sure.
let people know how they can find you and learn more about you.
Well, I'm at rubino.substack.com, and like I said, a lot of the writing there and the community there are focused on actionable stuff. What can we actually be doing to get ready for what's coming?
Great. Well, thank you so much for all of this. I think you really did cover a lot of really helpful, practical information, and I hope that that we'll be able to have this chat again.
Thanks, Sarah. Look forward to it.
Thank you so much. Friends, I hope you enjoyed that chat with John Rubino as much as I did. We'll be posting more content like this every week on Rumble and YouTube. So please like, subscribe, share, and comment there. That engagement will really help us reach more intelligent viewers like you. Be sure to also follow us on Twitter at collapse_life and on Substack. We have new stories coming out every week there, collapselife.substack.com. We are completely fueled by the support of viewers and readers like you, and we really, really appreciate your support. So please do take a few minutes to subscribe to us. We've dubbed Collapse Life the thinking person's guide to society and demise. It's about opening eyes, taking control, and taking action in our own lives. And I think John Rubino gave us a lot of good tools to do that today. We look forward to bringing you more engaging, intelligent voices like John's, and we can't wait to see you on the next broadcast. Until then, remember, keep your chin up. It's only collapse. See you soon.